The process for making a silicone rubber mold for injection casting is very similar to making any two-part silicone mold. In this case, we're using a thin-shelled car body as our model. Our first step is to protect the model from the application of the clay to make it easier for cleanup between steps. To do this, we use some plastic wrap placed around the model to act as a barrier between it and the clay. The clay is initially used to stabilize our model on our molding board. Because this is a very small model, we will not be using wooden blocks for holding the model in place. Build up a firm, solid base of clay for the model so that it stays in place. After we have got enough clay around the model, we begin the basic shaping of the mold. Having a good selection of sculpting tools is important in creating a proper mold box. Take your time to smooth out the clay. Again, the parting line is the most critical part in mold making. This is what ensures a good casting. Because you are working on a very small model here, you should really be careful and take your time in getting the parting line just right. Make sure the clay wall butts up nice and tight against the surface of the model. After we have our basic claying up of the model complete, it is time to put up the four walls of the mold box. Using our glue gun again, take your time to make sure that it is well sealed. After the 4 walls are in place, you then will use additional clay to smooth out and join the surfaces between the mold box, the clay, and the model. Make sure there are no leaks, so there is no place for the silicone to go but where it's supposed to. It will probably require some additional smoothing out of the clay where it attaches to the model after you've placed the mold box in place. Take your time during this process. Using acorn nuts as keys, we place them on the clay all the way around the model. This will act to lock the 2 halves of the mold together to produce a nice tight seal and a nice clean casting. The mixing process for preparing the silicone for casting our 2-part injection mold is the same as for any other 2-part mold. Weigh out your rubber on your scale, add your catalyst, mix it thoroughly so that the color is nice and even all the way through, and then de-air the rubber in the vacuum chamber. When you're pouring the rubber for this mold, you should start at the lowest point in the cavity of the model and allow it to flow up and over the entire surface, filling the mold box. We are now ready to mold the first half of the mold. You have to be very careful in this operation as we are working with a very thin shelled model that could easily pop out of the first half of the rubber if you do not try and remove it carefully. Again, the idea here is to get all the clay off, remove all the keys, and keep the model within the rubber mold half. Take great care to carefully clean all the clay away. There's a lot of work required in setting up the second half of the mold with the cleanup on the first half of the mold. It's critical that this is done correctly, otherwise there may be possible gaps between the two mold halves that will lead to problems in the casting process. We are now ready to set up our mold for the second half of our two-part keyed injection mold. Using foam board once again, we cut it to the appropriate height and length and build a wall going around our base mold. There is no right way or wrong way to make a mold box. Use whatever works. All that matters is that the mold box is sealed properly and does not leak. Once again, we use our glue gun to seal the mold box to the base. Make sure that you have covered every possible part of the base attaching to the mold box. If there are any leaks, silicone will find it and it'll work its way out of the mold box and you will waste rubber. Use lots of glue sticks. They're cheap compared to the price of silicone. As in all two-part molds, you need to spray the first mold half with a release that works with silicone. This will ensure that the two halves of the silicone mold do not stick together. Once again, weigh out your silicone base. Add the catalyst. And make sure you mix thoroughly. After the rubber has been mixed thoroughly, place it into your vacuum chamber and de-air the rubber. Remember again to pour the rubber in a thin stream, starting in the lowest part of the mold and allowing it to flow up and over the entire surface. Fill the mold all the way up to the very top of the mold box. We are now ready to demold the rubber mold from the mold box. Once again, the foam board should fairly easily peel away from the rubber mold. Take your time so as to not damage the silicone rubber. Once you've got all the cardboard off, you begin the process of peeling apart the two halves of the mold. These will be very snug to each other as they are poured nice and tight. With a little bit of work and effort, the two halves will pull apart. As you can see, we have a perfect reproduction of the casting. The next step in the preparation of the mold for injection casting is to drill vent holes and injection holes throughout the mold. The idea here is to pick all the low points and high points so that when you inject your resin into the mold, it fills every nook and cranny of the mold and all the excess has some place to come out. After you have drilled all the holes, use an X-Acto knife to cut them open and open them up as an injection port. Because this is a small block mold, it can be held together with rubber bands. After the rubber bands are on the mold and it's held together nice and snugly, we are ready to mix up our casting resin. Because we are shooting a very thin-walled casting shell here, it will not require a lot of casting resin. We are also going to pigment the resin for this casting as we want a specifically colored cast. Again, we are using a two-part 1:1 by volume casting resin that is fairly fast casting. You must make sure that the pigment is thoroughly mixed in to the resin before you mix the two halves. After mixing the two halves of the resin material together, it is now time to inject it into the mold. This is done using a large catheter-tipped syringe. We draw the resin up into the syringe and then inject it through one of the holes we created in the previous step. Take your time in injecting this so as to work all the air out of the mold, and you will see after a short period of time the resin starts coming up through the different holes that you created for venting the mold. Once the casting resin has cured completely in the thin cross sections that are sitting on top of the mold, you'll be able to demold the casting from the mold. If you demold it early, the casting will be soft and will deform. Carefully pull apart the two halves of the rubber mold to reveal our perfect resin casting.